All right, so now we are going to go ahead and get started to our introduction to invertebrates. So invertebrates mean they do not have vertebra. So we are going to be talking about things like snails, sea jellies, etc. We're going to have a lot of different animal phyla over the course of the next set of lecture series. So flashcards are always a great way to memorize different phyla and their characteristics. Highly recommend flashcards. All right, so this cladogram should look familiar. So we have our ancestral animal, and the first group we are going to start with is, of course, our sponges, the phylum Porifera. So phylum Porifera, sponges. The phylum Porifera is mostly marine, so you can find them in saltwater ecosystems. They are multicellular, but lack true tissues and organs. They are the simplest type of animal. They filter feed. They are filter feeders. So 80% of their food is too small for us to even see, let alone see with a microscope. And they conduct digestion intracellularly. And we'll go over what that means in detail for how they filter feed. They're asymmetrical, so that should sound familiar from the previous lecture. Asymmetry, so they have no symmetry. They are sessile as adults, and sessile is a term used to describe that they don't move. They are immobile. However, they do have a mobile larval stage. And so this is a picture up here at the top right of a sponge larva. And what this little larva will do is once it is fully developed, it will swim and find a substrate, so maybe like a rock, and latch onto it and then metamorphose into the adult sponge stage. They can go through both asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is going to be through fragmentation or budding. So pretty much you can break off a piece of a sponge, put it somewhere else, and it will grow into another sponge. For sexual reproduction, it will form gametes, so that's sperm and egg. The sperm is released into the water. So here is a very large adult sponge, and all of that mist-ish stuff coming out, that is sperm. So that sperm is just put out into the water, and then it gets sucked into another sponge, and fertilization will occur. So I do want to go over how sponges are filter feeding. We have some specialized cells that they're going to be using. The ones that we're going to pay special attention to are the terms porocyte here, porocyte. We have the choanocyte. So this is the zoomed in version of the choanocyte. And then we have the amoebocyte here. This is another cell. These two cells are very close to each other, and they work together to perform the function of digestion. So first, the choanocyte's flagella draws water through the porocytes into the sponge. So here's our choanocyte, and you can see there's lots of choanocytes all throughout the sponge. They have a single flagella that beats back and forth fast, and it creates a current inside of the adult sponge. That current pulls water through these porocytes. So water is coming into the sponge through the porocytes. Next, that flagellated choanocyte will trap food particles within the collar. So this is the collar of our choanocyte. Food particles are going to get latched into that collar, and then they will be pulled downward into the main body of the choanocyte and form these vacuoles. So vacuoles should sound familiar to you. Then those vacuoles of food particles are going to be transported through the choanocyte and into the amoebocyte. And then those food particles will be digested intracellularly, so within the cell of the amoebocyte. That filtered water is then going to be let out through the top of the sponge, called the osculum. All right, next we're going to get into the phylum Cnidaria. Cnidaria translates to, quote, stinging ones. So these are going to be things like sea anemones and sea jellies. So some unifying traits of the phylum: they are radially symmetrical, which means you can split them along any plane and you have two equal sides. They do have true tissue. They have nervous tissue, contractile tissue, and reproductive tissue. They are diploblastic, and they have this structure called the mesoglia. It's a gel-like substance which provides support for the body. So they don't have collagen, they don't have a skeletal system, They have this mesoglia, which gives them shape to their body. They have a gastrovascular cavity. This is a single opening that both takes the food in and releases the digested, unused portions of their food. So it's an everything hole. So that's the gastrovascular cavity. That is where digestion will occur. And they have a polymorphic life cycle. If you break apart that word, poly means many, morph means how they form. So they have many forms to their life cycle. There are two distinct stages, the polyp and the medusa stage. So here is a polyp stage. The polyp stage is going to be sessile, so they don't move. The medusa stage is going to be free swimming, so these will actually be swimming around. They have specialized cells that cause a stinging sensation. If you've ever been stung by a sea jelly, you've had up-close personal contact with these nematocysts. Nematocysts can be used to kill small fish, small crustaceans, as their food resources. And they have extracellular digestion. This means outside of the cell. So they're going to be digesting in that gastrovascular cavity. So here's a diagram showing these really interesting stinging cells. Again, these stinging cells are called nematocysts. So this is a very simple organism. This is probably a hydra, which we will go over different classes of cnidariads. If we zoom in to this tentacle, so zooming in, you can see specialized cells that almost have a small trigger. When that trigger is, well, triggered, then it releases this coiled thread inside of the cell. This thread shoots out, wraps around, and this is what's going to be causing that stinging sensation. You can see all those small barbs on this coil that's wrapped up inside of the nematocyst. So here's a little bit more detail, that polymorphic life cycle. So let's start here with our zygote. So our zygote is, again, right after fertilization, the fusion of egg and sperm. The zygote is going to develop into the blastula, and that blastula is eventually going to develop into our larval stage. That larval stage is going to find a substrate to latch onto and form into the adult polyp stage. So again, this is a non-moving or sessile organism. The polyp stage can go through asexual reproduction. So this is going to be making clones of itself. Asexual reproduction, no sex required. This is going to be done through a process called budding. So inside of one of these tentacles, one will specialize, or a couple will specialize, for asexual reproduction. And inside of the tentacle, small clones will form inside of those tentacles. And when it's ready for asexual reproduction, it will bud out, through budding, the clones of itself, but these clones are not polyps. They are in the medusa stage. The medusa stage is capable of producing egg and sperm. So rather than asexual reproduction, our medusa stage is going to be capable of sexual reproduction. All right, now we're going to get into classes. So I don't think we're going any more detailed than class. I believe that's as far down the phylogeny that we're going. So we are in the phylum Cnidaria, class Hydrozoa. Hydras. So hydras can be found in freshwater or saltwater ecosystems, so ponds or marine environments. They are going to be feeding on small microinvertebrates. Some examples of that are small crustacean-like organisms called Daphnia. So that's what this thing is inside of the larger hydra. This is a Daphnia. They can be colonial or solitary, so they can live in groups or they can live on their own. They are polyp stage dominant. This means the majority of their life is spent in the polyp stage. They will go through asexual reproduction, through budding, like we just went over, and produce the medusa stage. The medusa stage will then be capable of producing the egg and sperm, and sexual reproduction can occur. So here's the specific life cycle for the class Hydrozoa. We have our zygote over here, develops into the larva, forms the polyp. This is a colonial type of polyp, because we have many polyps on a single thing. So we have a reproductive polyp right here. So this is going to be creating those medusa stages through budding, and it'll shoot out those medusas. The medusas are free swimming. They can form egg and sperm. and go through sexual reproduction. All right, next we have the class Scyphozoa. This is the class that we've probably all seen most of. These are sea jellies and jellyfish. They are marine, mostly marine species, so they're going to be living in saltwater ecosystems. They can be extremely small, up to 2 millimeters. They can be that small, but then they can also be 2 full meters across. So that is very, very large, and those ones can be lethal in some cases. Our class Scyphozoa is Medusa form dominant. They have a very short polyp stage, or they have no polyp stage at all. So most of the organisms in class Scyphozoa are going to be medusas. Here in our class Scyphozoa, we see the first time where organisms are dioecious. So we can have separate male and female sea jellies, one producing egg and the other producing sperm. And like I did say, some of these organisms can be lethal if they, no one would really want to come across a 2-meter sea jelly. That would be a terrifying experience, and they could be lethal. So always be careful when you are seeing these sea jellies around. Next, we have our class Anthozoa. The class Anthozoa includes things like sea anemones and coral reefs. So corals are in the class Anthozoa. Those are colonial types of organisms in the class Anthozoa. They are polyp stage only, so they do not exhibit a medusa stage and can therefore produce egg and sperm. Polyps can reproduce sexually or through budding, and they can be solitary or colonial. So here we have an example of solitary polyps, but then things like corals and coral reefs are going to be colonial. So corals have colonial polyps built into the reefs. So many, many, many polyps all forming one big coral. So on this coral here, you'd probably have thousands of individual polyps. All right, so now we have gone up through this portion of our phylogeny, and we have gone over the phylum Cnidaria. So here we have radial symmetry as a derived trait. And now we are going to continue moving upward. The first one we're going to go over are flatworms and roundworms. They are more complex than cnidariads. This is evident because they have bilateral symmetry. So again, bilaterally symmetrical organisms are going to be more advanced. This is because we see the advent of cephalization. Cephalization is the gradual movement of nerve endings onto one end of the body, which will eventually form into a head and a brain in our more advanced animals. They are triploblastic, so they have all 3 of those germ layers. And those germ layers have tissue that can form into different tissue types, so skin and nervous tissue. And because we have that third one, they can evolve into muscle tissue as well, so more directional movement. All right, so first, this is a difficult name to say. This is the phylum Platyhelminthes. Platyhelminthes. These are our flatworms. Platy means plate-like, so plate. Overall traits for this phylum, they are unsegmented. So there's no segmentation within their body. So everything's just kind of one mass. They are bilaterally symmetrical. They are triploblastic, so they have all 3 of those germ layers. They are acoelomates, so they have no fluid-filled body cavity, so movement is restricted and simple. Many of these organisms are hermaphroditic, so they can play the role of either male or female. This image here shows 2 marine flatworms, and they are undergoing a contest that, and I am not kidding here, is referred to as penis fencing. These 2 flatworms, each one wants to perform the role of the male, because the male can just fertilize the other one and then swim off with no other obligations whatsoever. The female, on the other hand, would have to then fertilize the eggs, house the eggs, give birth, and not necessarily take care of the young because they're quite primitive, but they have a lot more work to do if they lose the battle, the penis fencing battle, and will then have to take care of the young. So neither one wants to be the female in this situation. And they can be free-living or parasitic. So free living means like these marine flatworms here, these three, these are all different types of marine flatworms. They just swim around the ocean, living their best life. This guy up here at the top right, this is a fluke, and a fluke can be parasitic, and we can even get infected with flukes. So we are still in the phylum Platyhelminthes and class Trematoda. These are those flukes, parasitic flatworms. They can be endo or ectoparasites. They have epicuticles that resist digestive enzymes. So this is a cuticle on the outside of the body, on the dermis, that can resist being digested. So they can be consumed and not be broken down. Life cycles involve many hosts. So here I have a diagram of the life cycle of a fluke and how many hosts they have to go through. And most of the body is dedicated to holding reproductive organs. So they really have two major functions: consume and reproduce. So the majority of the body is dedicated to producing egg and sperm. Next, we have another type of parasite. This is the class Cestoda. So we're still in the phylum Platyhelminthes and the class Cestoda. These are our tapeworms. They do not have a mouth or a digestive tract. They actually absorb through the skin. So they're gut endoparasites. So they are living inside endo, and they are parasitic, and they live in the gut. They will actually latch on to the intestinal wall of their host, and they will absorb the nutrients inside of the intestines as the host is trying to absorb the nutrients for themselves. Believe it or not, women and men used to both intentionally consume tapeworms so that they could lose weight. So they would intentionally put this parasite into their bodies, and it would latch onto their intestinal wall and absorb all the nutrients that they were eating, and so the person who ate it would lose weight. I, under no circumstance, ever, 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 would recommend this as a weight loss method. Eat healthy and exercise. You don't need to eat parasites. Okay, but we will move on. I digress. Okay, so we are back to our cladogram. So we've already gone up this line. Now we are in Bilateria. Oh goodness. Bilateria. So bilaterally symmetrical animals. And we have now gone over the phylum Platyhelminthes, our flatworms. So let's continue up to our next stage. The phylum Nematoda, roundworms. They kind of occupy almost every ecological niche. They can be in marine systems, freshwater systems, polar regions, tropic regions, and they can even be parasitic. They can be decomposers, so there are many species that can live in the soils and decompose. They can be parasitic, both for plants and for animals. And like the flatworms, they're still unsegmented. They are bilaterally symmetrical, and now they are pseudocoelomates. So we have evolved the pseudocoelom, the false body cavity. Now, this one is a pretty big distinction between them and flatworms. They have a complete digestive tract. They have a mouth and an anus. Everything up until this point has had what we refer to as an incomplete digestive tract, which means they had one hole that both consumed and excreted. An everything hole. What they ate and what they pooped came out of the same hole. That is an incomplete digestive tract. For our nematodes, they have evolved a separate mouth and anus. Mouth is on one end and the anus is on the other. So now we have two different holes to serve that function. And the digestive tract goes throughout the entire body. Now, I put this picture here because this is an example of a disease called elephantiasis, and this is actually caused by nematodes. Nematodes will get into the lymph system of humans and clog it. So lymph just continues to produce and produce and produce, and it has nowhere to go. It gets clogged up, and it results in these massive, massive growths on the body. And they can occur on the legs, they can occur on your arms, on your hands. It's very rare, and it is treatable now, but this is still something that can occur. All right, so now we have worked our way up through here. we do have body cavities. It's not a true body cavity, so we're going over on this side. Pseudocoelomates, and we just covered the phylum Nematoda. So I'm not going over each one of these, if you've noticed. I'm focusing on the major ones. So let's continue going. Now that we've gone over our pseudocoelomates, we're going to go over our coelomates. And the first phyla as you saw, we're going to go over are mollusks, the phylum Mollusca. This includes snails, clams, octopi, etc. This is the second largest animal phyla with about 110,000 described species. They can occur in all sorts of different types of ecosystems, including marine, freshwater, and terrestrial. Mollusca means soft-bodied. And each one of these, we're going to go over some different classes, and each one of these classes will have these three main body parts, but they will look quite differently for each one of the classes we go over. These three body parts are the mantle, the foot, and the visceral mass. We have a bunch of different types of defenses that have now evolved into our phylum Mollusca. We have shells, we have distasteful secretions, they can be poisonous. So we have a lot of different specializations, and it will determine or be based on class. So we are going to go over a few different classes in the phylum Mollusca. First, let's figure out what those three main body parts are. The foot is the muscle component of the body and is used for moving. This is going to be highly, highly modified depending on class. The mantle. The mantle is a modified epidermis that produces the gills for respiration or breathing and secretes a shell in some species. So it's the mantle that produces the snail shell. Finally, we have the visceral mass. The visceral mass is pretty much everything else. It's the collection of organs used for digestion, excretion, and reproduction. Oh, I did have this GIF here. This is to show the radula. The radula is a common feeding structure that we see in slugs and snails, and it's like a rasping structure. So here's a cartoon picture of it, and this is a snail actually using the radula. Okay, the first class. So phylum, Mollusca, class, Polyplacophora. These are called chitons. Their common name is chitons. So poly means many, plaque means plate, and phore, that phora should sound familiar. We've seen this ending before. So the root word phore means bearing or to lift up. So this is a many, plate-bearing organism. Many, plate-bearing. Polyplacophora. Okay. They are exclusively marine. They live in intertidal zones, usually on rocks. So where there's high and low tides on coastal areas, this is where you're going to find chitons. They are nocturnal, and they are quite slow-moving. They have 8 calcareous dorsal plates. So they have 8 plates that are made up of calcium, and dorsal means on the side of the back. So they have 8 calcium plates on their backs. They're mostly herbivorous, so they're mostly eating plants, and they'll use that radula, so that radula we saw on the other slide, to scrape algae off of rocks. For reproduction, they do go through sexual reproduction, and this is going to be external. This means the egg and the sperm are just going to be released into the water, and they will find each other in the water. So, external fertilization. They do have gills. The gills are going to be attached to that mantle, and they use that to get oxygen from the water. Next, we have the class Gastropoda. Gastropoda translates into stomach foot. Gastropods are going to include things like snails, slugs, marine slugs, etc. So we have a lot of diversity within this class. So phylum Mollusca, class Gastropoda. They are the most diverse class within the phylum. There's over 85,000 described species, which composes about 70% of the phyla. The only mollusk to successfully invade land. So snails and slugs are capable of coming onto land. Some adaptations that they have to allow them to come onto land. First, they have a single lung. This is called the pneumatostome. So this is highlighted here, so that's a term I want you to know. So here is the opening for the pneumatostome, and this allows them to breathe open air. So they were able to come onto land. If you've ever played with a slug ever, maybe I'm just a weirdo, I've played with a lot of slugs, you would notice that they are quite slimy. That is a mucus covering. That mucus protects against water loss, and it can be very foul tasting, so it can also protect them against predators. If they are snails, many snails will exhibit this structure or this trait called snail gut torsion. Snail gut torsion is when they have a spiral-shaped shell, and the gut will create a U-turn inside of the shell so that they can excrete outside of their shell. So here I have an image of how this kind of looks. So they will consume in their mouth using that radula to scrape food off, and it will go into the gut. The gut does a U-turn right here, and then their anus is located at the top of their shell. So essentially, snails are going to be pooping on their heads. Very unfortunate, but at least they have a shell for protection. Gas exchange. This is going to be done either with external gills. So if they're a water species, if they are found in the water, then they might have external gills, or they might have that single lung, the pneumatostome, which would help them breathe on land. They exhibit internal fertilization. So fertilization is happening inside of the body. Some of these organisms are hermaphroditic, so they can produce both egg and sperm and serve the role as both male and female. And they can actually simultaneously fertilize each other. If two snails start wrapping themselves around each other, they can both fertilize one another while they are going through sexual reproduction. All right, next we have the class Bivalvia. Bi meaning two, valves meaning valves. Two valves. This is the class that incorporates clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. They can be both freshwater and marine. They have a hinged shell with two valves. This shell can clamp shut to avoid predation, so it's a protective measure. They have very strong muscles that allow that shell to remain clamped very tightly shut. These muscles are called adductor muscles. They have external fertilization, so the egg and sperm will be released into the water and fertilization will happen outside of the body. They are filter feeders. So one of those valves is a siphon that sucks water into the body, and water and food particles will pass over the gills and will trap the food particles inside of the mantle cavity, and they will be transported to the digestive tract. Their gills are internal. They're inside of that shelled body. And in this case, their foot can be used for digging. So that is a clam using its siphon to propel itself through the water. And then here is, this is another type of bivalve that is using its foot to dig into the sand. So it's very surprising that they are capable of such extreme types of movement, but most people just aren't lucky enough to really see this type of behavior because they are mostly, in the water, so we just don't see these behaviors as often as you would think. So there's that foot digging into the sand. All right, next we have the class Cephalopoda. Cephalopoda can be translated into head foot. Ceph for head, pod means foot. Cephalopoda, head foot. There's about 1,000 different marine species of cephalopod. They evolved probably 600 million years ago. And in this case, that foot is modified into tentacles. So this is the foot of the class Cephalopoda, or these tentacles. They have an internal shell. So here we do have a shell. It's internal, so inside of the body, unless, of course, it's a nautilus. A nautilus is a type of cephalopod, but their shell is external. This group of organisms can undergo parental care, so they will actually take care of their fertilized eggs, making sure that they will all hatch. This is done to the detriment of the mother because she will spend all of her time taking care of her eggs without feeding, without sleeping. She will just make sure that they are surviving. And whenever those eggs start to hatch into her young, she will actually die in some cases. They have extremely advanced cephalization. This means they have a very well-developed head with sensory nerve systems. They are the most intelligent type of invertebrates. They are extremely smart. They are capable of solving puzzles. They can get out of jars. And they have the largest brain-to-body mass ratio. They have a very complex eye with a lens, so they can create a more complicated picture of their environment. And they also have specialized cells called chromatophores. Chroma is relating to color, so it's color bearing. Here's that "for" again. This allows them to change not only the color of their skin, but also in some instances, the texture of their skin. They also have sensory cells that can sense sound and gravity. These are called statocysts. And finally, they do have a siphon, like a lot of the other classes. They have a siphon that they use for jet propulsion. So here is the siphon. They can suck water in and propel it out and force themselves forward. Oh, here's some cool examples of the chromatophores. So it blends right into that environment, and then it can change color and texture. So you can barely even see it whenever you're coming up on it because it's using those chromatophores to camouflage almost perfectly into their environment. This is an example of their intelligence. This octopus is capable of spinning this lid and allowing itself to escape. So extremely, extremely smart. Another example of their intelligence, some of them will actually use tools. This octopus found 2 coconut shells on the ocean floor, and when it felt threatened, it clamped that coconut shell around itself and then rolled down the hill. So pretty awesome example of intelligence in cephalopods. Let's see. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and pause this lecture where we are here. So the next thing we're going to start is the phylum Annelida. So we will pick that up in the next video.